Welcome to the Church of the Living Godcast. Our prayer is that this message speaks to you, impacts you, and inspires you. Please enjoy today's message, and we invite you to contact us if you need prayer, appreciate this word, or would like more information on Church of the Living God. Be blessed today.
Paul was in Jerusalem. He was at the temple. Some of the men who saw him in Asia preaching stir up the crowd and they arrest Paul. They bring him to the court to stand before the Jews. He defends himself and they can't find any fault in him. So they decide, we'll kill him. Paul's family and friends learn of the plot to kill him, to take his life, and they alert Paul. Paul tells the Romans and they transport him off. And he stands trial before the governor. And before Felix and then Agrippa, Paul has to stand and defend himself, and he does well, and he testifies. And in the middle of it, the Lord says to Paul, don't worry, because I've got a mission for you. I've got a mission for you to go to Rome, and just as you testified of me in Jerusalem, you're going to testify of me in Rome. Paul is headed somewhere intentionally. Paul is not headed to Rome just because. Paul is headed to Rome because there's something there for him. Can I tell you, you better know when you're headed for something that is destined for you. You better know when you're going after something because it seems like a good idea. And you better know when you're going after a promise because it was ordained to you. Paul will not be deterred because he has heard from the Lord. You are going to Rome. There are things in our lives that we've got to know that we know we're going to get to. There are things in our lives we've got to determine that we know no matter what happens, we are going to make it to where we're headed. Because there is something for us. Paul knew there was something for him in Rome. I don't know what was going through his mind. I think he probably had it hard to imagine all of the blessings that would be bestowed upon him once he made it to Rome. But he knew that he had to get to Rome. And he was determined to not let anything stand in his way. We have got to be determined to know that when God has told us we are going somewhere, that we are going to get there. We are not going to be deterred by the things of this life, by circumstances and situations, by mishaps and failures. We have got to be determined that we are going to make it to the promises that God has spoken over our lives, to the promises He's spoken over this house. He has spoken great things over this house. And there have been times throughout the years that we've taken steps back and steps to the side and steps forward and then back again. But I want to tell you, as sure as Paul knew he had to get to Rome, we've got to fulfill that will. As sure as Paul knew that he had to get to Rome and testify of the Lord, we are going to fulfill the will that God has promised over this house because He has promised it. And He who has promised is faithful. Paul was determined. Determination comes not by knowing who we are, but knowing who made the promise. Paul was determined not because he thought, I'm good enough to get to Rome. I'm strong enough to get to Rome. I can stand in there long enough to get to Rome. Paul knew that He who promised is faithful. And if He made the promise, He'll keep the promise. Paul was determined he was going to get to Rome. He said the wind was against us. We had to sail under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. The word wind here is a stream of air, a strong and stormy wind, a violent agitation. A violent agitation. Paul said we had some agitations along the way. We had some agitations that came our way. Sometimes in pursuit of the promise, you run into some agitations. And sometimes those agitations are violent. Sometimes they're not so violent, and sometimes they're real violent. Sometimes they're violent enough that you feel like you can't make it anymore. But Paul said we had to sail anyway. Paul said we knew that the wind was against us. Before we put the boat in the water, we knew that the wind was against us. But we went anyway. We went anyway. We faced hardships in this house. We knew that the call of this house was a hard call. We knew that to fulfill that will was a big mission, and we went anyway. We put the boat in the water and we went anyway. Not because we were confident in who we are, but because we knew that we had a call to fulfill. We knew that there was something over this house that we had to fulfill. Paul said we went anyway. There was violent agitation and we went anyway. We sailed anyway because we had somewhere to get. He said, we went anyway, and we sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, and we came to Myra and Lycia. There a centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy, and he put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty at Cnidus. and the wind did not allow us to go further. We sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone. Paul said that we put the ship in the water and we sailed slowly for a number of days. I want you to know this morning that your agitations that you run into do not have the authority to stop your progress. That the things that you face in this life do not have the authority to stop your progress. Paul did not say we stopped sailing. He said we sailed slowly. Sometimes in this life you got to move slowly. Sometimes you're running and sprinting and you're accomplishing things at great pace, and sometimes you're barely moving. But I want to tell you that the God of the sprint is the God of the crawl. The God of the run is the God of the moving slowly. Paul said we moved slowly. He said we crept along, and it felt like we were never going to make it. It felt like we were never going to get there. But slowly and surely we were picking up ground. There were times when it felt like we weren't going to have enough to fill the sanctuary, like we weren't going to have enough to make the bills meet. But slowly but surely we kept moving. We kept our feet moving, and slowly but surely when we look back, we had accomplished something. We've come further than we ever thought we would. There were times when we had to move slowly. There were times when we couldn't sprint. There were times when we didn't have the resources or the people or the finances to sow a church in Mount Sterling. But look where we are today. Look how far we've come. And look at all that God has accomplished. And it wasn't because we ran the whole way. It's because we refused to stop moving. Sometimes you got to be determined to stop moving. Sometimes you got to be determined that if I got to get there slowly, then that's how I'll get there. But Paul said we kept moving. Paul said we had to change course. We had to sail south. Paul's moving from Italy across the sea west. And he said the winds were so strong we started moving slowly and it felt like we were going to stop. So we changed directions. We changed directions. Why? Because we knew we had to keep moving. The key to fulfilling the promises in the kingdom sometimes are just keep moving. Sometimes all you got to do in the kingdom to get to where God's promised is just keep your feet moving. Just keep picking up your feet and putting them down. Just keep moving forward into what God's promised you. Sometimes you run, and sometimes you got to walk slowly. And sometimes God's going to change your direction. We get so anxious in the church so many times when we experience opposition. So many times we want to look at the presence of opposition and think that it means there's an absence of promise. But more often than not, it is the presence of opposition that signals the presence of a promise. It is when we run into opposition in this life that we can almost be assured that we are headed in the right direction. Paul said we started out and the winds were against us and we had to slow way down. And then we had to change our path. I don't think if Pastor Hall would have written down his vision 20 years ago and told you how he thought it should work, he would have picked this way. I don't think he would have chosen the heartaches and the heartbreaks and the mishaps and the trips and the falls and the failures. God has a way of taking us in a direction that we never imagined. God has a way of taking us around things that we just want to go through, or through things that we just want to go around. He has a way of changing our direction and our trajectory just when we think we've got it all figured out. Paul said we knew the winds were against us, but we put the boat in anyway. And we started off and we were going slowly and we were satisfied with that. But we had a change. Church, there's been changes in this house over the years. There's been many changes in this house over the years. There's been people come and go. There's been words promised, and it feels like words fail. And directions have changed what seems like a dozen times. If you've been in this house for very long at all, you've seen us change directions, change trajectories, change which way we're headed. But the outcome has never changed. Where we're going has never once changed. We know for a surety where we're headed. We know for a surety what we're headed towards. And our direction may change, our path may change, the way we go about getting there may change, but I'm confident that the God who set us out on this path is the God who's going to continue guiding us. Paul said we had to change path. We had to go a different direction. And not only did we have to go a different direction, we had to go the long way around. The short route was a straight line, east to west. And Paul said we made it about this far before we had to go all the way down around the tip of the island. Paul said we had to go the long way around, but we kept moving. We get so distracted by direction changes in this life. And I think sometimes we're so fickle in our humanity that when God changes our direction, we think that's it. The promise is over. We'll never reach. God, how could we get there by going this way? How could we get there by going this direction? It doesn't make any sense. Why would you take us around when you could just take us across? Why would you take us down around this seemingly deserted island when you could just take us across the sea? God, aren't you the God of the wind and the waves? Couldn't you speak a word and change the circumstances? But God has a purpose. I think if you look anecdotally over this house's life, there is a purpose in the change of direction. God is always working to accomplish something, even when it feels like He's taking us the long way around. Paul in chapter 28, now in the neighborhood of that place where the lands belonging to the chief man of the islands was named Publius. Paul got shipwrecked. Not only did God take him the long way around, they crashed his boat. Maybe by some of their own mishaps. When Paul said we shouldn't sail and they said we're going to sail anyway. But God crashed his boat on an island that seemed deserted. Sometimes God's going to crash your boat. Sometimes God will crash your boat. He'll take you the long way around and then crash your boat. And it feels like you've been deserted and abandoned, but He's working a purpose. It says, in the neighborhood of that place where the lands belonging to the chief man of the island named Publius, who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days, it happened that the father lay sick with a fever and dysteria. Paul visited him and prayed, and putting his hands on him, healed him. And when this had taken place, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured, and they honored us greatly. And when we were about to sail, they put us on board everything that we needed. The time spent between your destination and your promise, the origination and the destination, is not time lost. The time spent between your origination and your destination is not time lost. We get so anxious in the sailing. We get so anxious when God's changing our direction and the seas seem to be tossing us around that we think there's no possible way that any of this is worth anything. We get so lost in the middle that we forget that God's working a purpose. God took Paul around an island and crashed his boat, and he saved a whole island worth of people. Healed a man of a sickness that would have killed him, and saved a whole island worth of people and gave him favor in the process. There are times in this life that we go straight from our origination to our destination. And there are times in this life where we got to take the long way around. But I want to encourage you that in your destination, in the journey to your destination is a purpose. The time that you are spending in the journey is not a time that is lost. This house spent 20 years trying to get the first spoke of that wheel planted. And who knows how many we'll spend before the next spoke is planted. But the time spent between now and then is not lost. God has done great things in this house. How many souls have been saved at this altar? How many lives have been changed at this altar? How many healings and manifestations of God's glory have taken place in this house in what we would have called the mess between our origination and our destination? What God is doing in the middle of our journey is just as important as what He'll do at the destination. What He is doing in the middle is just as important. In fact, I would argue we may impact more lives between now and then than we do at the destination. God is doing something in this house. And we can't allow the enemy to tell us, well, if you're not in the middle of planting a spoke, it's not worth anything. Well, you've got a dream and a vision, and if you're not fulfilling it, then you're not doing what God's called you to do. We're doing good work in this house. We're fulfilling a good plan in this house. We're reaching people and changing lives and turning families around because we're introducing them to a man that can change everything. And we can't get distracted by the fact that maybe right now we're not planting a spoke. Maybe right now we're in the waiting. Maybe God's taking us the long way around. And maybe He's doing it because He's got somebody to save. Maybe He's doing it because He's got a life that He's got to impact. Somebody that He's going to change. He took Paul the long way around. And what seemed like a mess turned into a miracle for that island worth of people. A man healed of a disease that medicine wouldn't be introduced for centuries. And God used a shipwreck to birth a miracle into an island. People in heaven today, because God wrecked a ship, God can take a shipwreck and turn it into a miracle. He'll take a shipwreck and turn it into a miracle. He'll turn the messes in the middle and He'll turn them into miracles. What we thought was an aggravation and what we thought was a violent agitation, God said, I'm using to change people. I know it's not convenient and I know it's not fun, but I'm working something in this city. I'm working something in this city. Lives that are impacted today. Families that are changed. Because we said, we'll put our hand to the plow. Until the spoke comes, we'll keep working. Well, it hasn't come yet. Who cares? It'll come when it comes. It'll get here when it gets here. And in the meantime, we're going to work. We're going to work and impact lives and change people. Because that's what we were put here to do. And if He takes us the long way around, then He's God and He can do it that way. Paul said we had to go the long way around. It went from bad to worse. We were making bad time. And then we had to turn. And then our boat got wrecked. But God was in it. Church, God has been in it. From the foundation of this house, God has been in it. From the creation of this vision, God has been in it. And there have been days where it seemed like He forgot His promise. And times where it felt like it would never come to pass. And seasons where it felt like all of hell was fighting against us. But God has been in it. God has been in it. And He has changed this city. And He is going to continue to changing this city because He's in it. Because we refuse to give up in the middle. We refuse to stop in the middle. It took a long time to get the first spoke, but we refused to stop and allowed God to take us the long way around and allowed Him to work in us while we were going through what seemed like a mess. Oh, if you haven't been in the house long, you may not understand. There were some messes. There were some times that hearts broke. Some times that tears were shed. Some times that maybe some anger came about. But God was in the middle of it. God was in the middle of it. And His promises over this house can't be deterred by agitations. They can't be deterred by opposing winds. They can't be deterred when the enemy thinks he's convinced us to take the long way around. The promises over this house stand sure and strong and steadfast because He who promised is faithful. He who promised is faithful. Paul said Paul ended up healing a man and being blessed by an island of heathens in what seemed like a mess. Chapter 28, verse 11. And after 3 months we set sail in a ship that had wintered in the island, a ship of Alexandria with twin gods as figureheads. Putting in at Syracuse, we stayed there for 3 days. And from there we made a circuit and arrived at Rhegium. After a day, a south wind sprang up. And on the second day we came to Puteoli. Paul said we had fought for months. We had fought agitations. We had fought opposing winds. We had taken the long way around. We had been shipwrecked. We had had to deal with the natives. Paul got bit by a viper and they thought he was going to die and they called him a murderer. Paul said we went through all this junk, but we kept moving. And the time came that we were able to put the boat back in the water. And when we put the boat back in the water, things started to change. Paul said a south wind sprang up. The word there in Greek for a south wind sprang up is a sudden change in the wind. Paul said there was a shift in the wind. Paul said what was once against us was now for us. The wind that was once opposing us was now propelling us. Church of the Living God, I came this morning to tell you that a south wind has sprang up, that there is a shift in the wind. God sent me here this morning to tell you that that thing that was against us is now for us. What was opposing us is propelling us. What was working against us is working in our favor, and the season has changed. The atmosphere is shifting, and God is moving in this house. The south winds have sprang up, the exact wind that they needed. The wind was not kind of in their favor, it was the exact wind that they needed. A south wind. They covered 185 miles in one day's time. Unheard of at that time. Why? Because when God starts to move in your direction, you'll get to places faster than you ever thought possible. It might have taken us 20 years to sow the first one, but God said the wind has changed, the wind has shifted, and it's not going to take 20 years for the next one, but something has shifted in the atmosphere. Last Thursday, the winds began to blow in Lexington, and I went out for lunch, and it was freezing. It went from 70 degrees in the morning to 40 degrees, and it got down to 20 that night. The winds caused a change in the season. When the winds begin to blow, the seasons change. The shifting of the wind isn't just to propel us, but the season over this house has changed. The season over this house has changed, and it will impact this city and this region, and I believe this nation and this world, because God is shifting the wind in favor of this house. For decades, we have fought against opposing winds. For decades, we have fought against violent agitations. But God said the shifting in the wind is happening now, and it is going to propel us into the promise. It is going to propel us forward into all that He has accomplished for us. The season is changing over this house, and the winds are shifting over this house. The violent agitations that the enemy has set over this house cannot stand when he shifts the wind. When He shifts the wind, everything changes. The atmosphere changes, and the season changes, and we get to places we never thought we could get to. We go places we never thought we could go. We reach people we never thought we could reach. And we do things we never thought we could have done. Last Wednesday, all he gave me was wind. What in the world am I supposed to do with wind? And he said a shift in the wind. And I said, that's not any more helpful. That's how we talk. Don't talk to him like that unless that's how you talk. That's how we talk. He said a shift in the wind. I about fell off my chair yesterday morning when verse 28 said, a shift in the wind. A shift in the wind. The original Greek term, and it doesn't say just a shift, it says a sudden shift. A sudden shift in the wind. When God begins to move in your favor, it's suddenly. When God begins to blow in your direction, it's suddenly. And it propels you into the promise. He arrived 185 miles away in one day. 185 miles away. Historians say their boat was probably moving somewhere around 8 or 9 knots an hour, which doesn't sound like a big deal. The average speed for a boat in that day and time was somewhere around 1.5 or 2 knots. Supernatural propelling. Supernatural propelling. Church, God has shifted the wind in this house. And with the wind shift, the atmosphere changes, and the season has changed over this house. And I know it as sure as I'm standing here that the season over this house has changed. The winds have changed, and the season over this house is different. It is different. There have been violent agitations, violent opposition to what God wants to do in and through this house. But those days I'm not going to say the opposition and the agitations won't come. We might be moving so fast it doesn't matter. Because He is propelling us. He is propelling us towards that promise. Propelling us towards what He has spoken over this house. The winds have shifted. The atmosphere is different. You can sense there's a change. The season is different because the winds have shifted. Stand with me this morning.
Thank you for listening to today's Church of the Living Godcast. We trust and pray that you were blessed by today's word. If you'd like to contact us for prayer or for more information about Church of the Living God, please visit our Facebook page at Win City COLG or give us a call at 859-745-1865.